Okay, I see people are still rolling in, but I'm going to go ahead and get started with introductions. Good evening to everyone. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you in advance to the panelists. This was kind of put together at the last second and people immediately said, passing, let's do it. So thank you all for that. Certainly thanks to the Langston Hughes Society, who is hosting this in partnership with the College Language Association. If you are not a member of LHS or CLA, please join us. So I am going to start with the introductions. Starting with myself. For those of y'all who don't know who I am Dr. Tara Green, Professor of African American and African Diaspora Studies at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. And I have 2 forthcoming books, so look for those when they come out in January and February. One is on Black women and pleasure. The other one is on the wonderful, marvelous 10 years in the making, Alice Dunbar Nelson. These introductions are not an indication of anything other than the way that they are on my paper, okay? So I will start off with Dr. Tara Betts. So my Tara, she's Tara. And she is this great poet, y'all. So check out her next published collection, a forthcoming poetry collection titled Refuse to Disappear, which will be released by Word Works Books next year. Congratulations on that, Tara. And she is also a proud Chicagoan, which is one of the reasons why I asked her to sit on this panel. We have Dr. Julia S. Charles Lennon, who is the Associate Professor of English at the University of Colorado at Boulder. And she has published That Middle World, Race, Performance, and the Politics of Passing, which came out from UNC Press just last year. So check that out, please. I'm giving you all a syllabus, a homework list here. Dr. Donavan Ramon, who is a newly minted Advanced Assistant Professor of English at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, who is working on a book, but has already published for SAR, South Atlantic Review, an edited collection on Nella Larsen's passing back in 2019 on the in commemoration of the 90th anniversary of that novel. We have Dr. Charles Nero, who is Benjamin E. Mays 20 Distinguished Professor of Rhetoric, Film, and Screen Studies and Africana at Bates College. And he is my partner in crime, the co-editor of a special issue on Richard Wright's cinematic adaptations to be published by Palimpsest, A Journey on Women, Gender, and the Black International in the Future. We're in the process of editing that project. And we have Dr. Karla Holloway, very well known, right? James B. Duke Emerita, Professor of English and Professor of Law, Duke University, and the author of the novel, A Death in Harlem. One review declared it to be the spiritual successor of Nella Larsen's passing. So if you have not read that yet, please do so. We'll talk a little bit about that today. Let's get started. So there are many interviews coming out of Rebecca Hall. Thankfully, we don't have a screenwriter and a director who's sort of hidden. She's doing these interviews. So we're able to learn a little bit more about her vision. So she says personally, she found out at some point earlier in her life that her grandfather is a man of mixed race. So there's some African ancestry there. She saw him and her mother as Black folks. Her mother was born in Detroit. When I hear Detroit, I just start thinking about Black people, quite frankly. So I don't know how this could have been hidden. But in any case, her mother did not talk about the fact that there was some African ancestry, or did not talk about herself as Black, did not talk about the father as Black. Now, I have a question about whether or not he should have been thought of as Black. We can debate that. So she said that she did not have a lexicon, being British, to talk about passing until she read Nella Larsen's Passing. I'm loving the comments that are popping up in the chat. So let us sort of clarify. Let's get a lexicon going here. What is passing, panelists? And how would you say that Hall expands, Rebecca Hall expands the long conversation about passing? Who wants to start? Dr. Holloway, let's go.
I'll do the what is, because it's an interesting, before I retired, I got a degree in law and went into the law of race, the laws surrounding race. So passing is legally a deception. It's legally fraud. And there have been cases in the United States, especially around marriage, that have been brought. She didn't tell me she was, or I didn't know she was till she took off her clothes, or it's usually a he and a she. And so legally, passing is a fraudulent representation of yourself as one thing when you're another. And that can lead to a legal breach of contract situation. And it's interesting to think about it culturally because.
And so then in those cases, it is, I'm sorry, my internet kind of goes in and out sometime if I cut you all out. But so the law takes on this issue of passing and defines it as race.
Well, it defines it as particularly race. In one famous case in 1924, the Rhinelander case, which is ironically mentioned in the novel Passing. Well, you remember the Rhinelander case, where a young white wealthy boy has a long-standing affair and then marriage with a Black girl, Alice Rhinelander. And his daddy makes him divorce her because he's concerned about who the family money is going to pass to. Well, the only way legally they could do that is to argue misrepresentation or fraudulent contract. So the law isn't as interested in, so what makes you Black? It just says, oh, you're Black. Well, of course, in Louisiana, the law did, because we had mulattoes and quadroons and quintroons and octoroons. And if you think about it, any society that goes to that extent to find a name for what percentage you are Black is very concerned about telling who is and who is not. So yes, it is about race. Arguably in this book, you might be passing as heterosexual, but the notion is you represent yourself as one thing when you are something else, as if there is a legal representation of race.
Okay. Anyone else want to take that on?
I'm from New Orleans, as is Dr. Green, and I grew up, and this was always a topic of conversation, that there were people who were passing and what did that mean, and comments about, someone would perhaps sometimes slip and say something like, and make a reference to their kitchen and referring to their hair, for example, and you'd go like, oh, okay, that would clue you in. And of course, I grew up in a home where we always had, Ebony and Jet magazine. And I remember those magazine when Ebony would do those features on passing. And usually it was about racial passing. And frequently. There was this one classic issue that they would always reprint from time to time, in which it took place in Chicago, and there were people who were passing, some conditionally, some permanently, passing for employment, and they had pictures of maybe like 18 people on the page, and you said which one of these people is white and which one is black, who's passing, who's not passing. So that Negro, I'm sorry, Negro. Thank you. That was Negro, Negro, yeah, capital N. Yeah, which one is Negro and which one is not. And that was the way that I came in. That was one of the ways that I came to understand racial passing.
I want to jump in, particularly about what Dr. Holloway was saying about the legal sort of definition of passing, right? And I think if we're dealing with the literature, I think the cultural definition matters just as much, right? Because the cultural definition, particularly from folks on the Black side, right? Like there are these moments, and I'm sure we'll talk about them in the film, but there are these moments in the film and in life where Black folk really feel like they have some sort of instinctive faculty of recognition. Like we can always kind of tell. And I think Walter White says something to the effect of like, we can always tell a paper thin white Negro anytime, right? And I think part of that sort of look that's given, or a smirk that's given, it's sort of Black folks saying, well, we're not going to tell on you regardless of what's happening, right? And so I think it's important to note that the legal definition is also linked to white supremacy, right? It's also linked to an outage or a pushing Black folk outward from certain opportunities, right? And so even though there is a legal definition and that legal definition is linked to deception, I might argue that passing is not so much deception as it is a political kind of tool to access other sides of the so-called color line, right? And I think that particularly if we're going to talk about the novel, we have to note that the legal definition is also linked to white supremacy, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Absolutely, because it does link us to who gets the property, right? And what's tied into that, the money, the power. Dr. Ramon.
And I would say one of the strengths of the novel and the movie, that they both expand the definition of passing. Whereas we've been talking about racial passing explicitly and how it's embedded in the legal discourse, we can also talk about the ways which Nella Larsen and the Netflix movie Passing, how it's not just about race. I would say that both expand, and we could talk about passing in terms of sexuality, or maybe even in terms of class, in terms of activities. Certainly, Irene is passing as she's happy in her marriage when she clearly is not. The marriage is falling apart. So when I think about passing from both the novel standpoint and the movie, it's not just about race. Race is part of it, certainly it is, but embedded in that, there are many ways which the novel and the film expand what it means to cross boundaries.
Mm-hmm. So we can talk about race. So when Black people talk about passing, usually we are talking about race, right? Mm-hmm. At least historically, we probably expanded that at this point, maybe even thanks to Nella Larsen. But there is the sexuality. Is there anything else that we want to add to that list that you see Hall bringing out in terms of passing?
I think Hall brings, and I don't know if this is giving probably her too much credit or not, right? Because, other authors and other depictions have done this too, but there's a class conversation that's always happening, right? And there's a passing from, or I would argue a crossing from one class to another class status, right? Because passing, the thing that makes passing or crossing what it is that the performance has to suit precedent, right? So you can't just look the part, you have to actually perform the part as well, right? I can't just say I'm white, I have to actually look it, be it, sound it, all of those things. And I think she does a good job with, particularly in the club scene or in the Negro ball scene or whatever it is where they're all like dancing and carrying on. There's I think she does a good job of blurring several different boundaries in that scene. particularly with the sexuality and things like that. But there's also this crossing that I don't think we discuss very much. And there's a gender crossing, not necessarily in passing the novel as much as it is in life, if we consider like some other folk who have passed throughout and have passed as another gender. But, you know, I think that's worth a conversation as well.
Mhm.
Well, that
Yeah,
moment when Zulina or Zoo is in the garden talking with Claire, and Irene walks in and she's not doing the housework. She's up there, you know, talking about how nice the sky is. That's a form of, exactly as you said, class passing, where we know that intersectional boundary was breached as far as Irene was concerned when her maid, the help, is talking to her as if she's talking to her friend as if she's an equal. So I love the way you're noticing it and calling out the class boundaries that were both maintained and challenged by passing, but are implicit in this too. Thank you for that.
May I, if it's all right, would it be possible for me to share my screen since you brought up that particular scene?
Sure.
Because I think it might be interesting for us to see that moment.
Yeah.
All right, I'll do it. Let me share my screen then with you because it's, here we go. Share some.
I have not learned to share screen.
Zelina, out back, Rennie. What in the world? Claire, aren't you freezing? When the Lord brings you a magical day like this, I say lap it up. You're crazy. Zoo, can you help with these groceries?
They call this an Indian summer.
An Indian summer? Zoo. Zoo and I were just talking about the Charlestons next door. That eldest.
Perfect. Perfect.
I love that scene, and it's such a provocative scene because, as you were mentioning, it elides, you know, class issues. What's going on there? It's Zulina being Claire is losing control.
Yes.
Claire is losing control of this. I mean, Irene is losing control of her house. Irene is losing control of her life, and she's no longer able to control the person that Nella Larsen called a creature, a short brown skinned creature, Zulina.
I think there's also the moment, because you showed this scene, there's also the moment to recognize that Zulina is a darker skinned character.
Yes, yes.
And so there's a breach of this kind of, theoretically, there's a breach of this community between these two fair-skinned women who would understand this particular class, right? But then there's something else to be said about the fact that Zulina, there's more tension in the film than there is in the book between Zulina and those who she works for. But I do think that there's important to note that when in the novel, when Claire is leaving, her family has come to get her originally, she was actually acting as a sort of maid for them, right? And so there is no breach of class status between Claire and Zulina necessarily, right? I mean, but based on her performative identity, sure, but not when she left home and she went to live with her aunt and whomever. She was basically cooking and cleaning and doing all of the things that Zulina does. And so there's still a commonality there that I think is important. And so we have these worlds that are colliding, and the reason that Claire is so comfortable in the moment is because she understands the service that this woman is providing. She understands it intimately, I would argue.
Yes, Dr. Betts.
Yeah, I would concur with what Professor Charles Lennon said. And I'm also just feeling like for me, seeing these scenes where the tension builds up between Irene and Claire, you also start to see all these other Black members of her family and her intimate circle start to endear themselves just more and more, like almost like they don't even want to talk to Irene at all. And to me, that's very telling, because you could be a light-skinned Black person in America and still not curry as much favor as a white person. And they never say that in the film or the novel, but it's true in our lived realities. And so I think when you think about that, and then you think about all those legal ramifications and things like the one drop rule, and how all of that has informed our understanding of critical race theory in the 21st century, it's really clear that, yeah, you can pass in any number of ways, but it's like, what about that passing informs the tensions between us? Like when Imani Perry talked about the film, she was talking about Claire's craving for emotional intimacy. And then when you watch Thompson earlier in the film, and she's trying to convince herself, I'm satisfied. Yeah. I'm satisfied with who I am. And she keeps talking about that. And then I'm like, yeah, she's lived this life where she's made all these decisions to be like, I am happy with who I am. Claire's never made that decision. She's always run from it. And now she's trying to run back to it at any cost. And then what happens when that happens? Like Larsen really created this world where you see what's at stake in an intimate way and not just in a legal way. So,
yeah. Dr. Holloway?
Yeah, I don't want to, especially for New York State, where interracial marriage was legal during the 1920s, I don't want to overstate the law's interest in, are you this or that? The interesting opening that the law gave was fraud, was how you represent something. It's good. You could get sued for fraud by saying, you know, I have this much money in the bank and really didn't. So instead of resolving the legal question about what is race, that's always the enigma, that's the cipher still in New York State. And in that Rhinelander case, which is so dramatic, I don't understand why it's not a movie yet, where they have the girl disrobe in the Alice Jones Rhinelander disrobe in the judge's office, because what they're looking for, and I have my students back when I was teaching, couldn't figure out, well, what couldn't they see on her arms? And I kept getting them to say, so it's the area around her nipples that they were trying to see, is that brown or is it pink? And he should have known. And so they weren't going to give a legal percentage. They were just going to say, you should have known what is obvious. The law was extraordinarily afraid of Black folks getting it, which is why I loved you talking about whiteness as privilege, Black folks getting the privileges that whiteness bestowed. And so that was the reason the law intervened, to make sure you didn't get what wasn't yours.
And I just, before going to Dr. Charles Lennon, in a conversation with a colleague about that, that disrobing moment, that there seems to be a presumption that she is Black, because would there be a question that a white woman would be asked to disrobe in public and examined in that way, right?
No way.
Yeah. So the presumption is there. Let's just use the body to prove what we already know. Yes.
Which, to be sure, is the thing about why passing can even happen, right? Because it presumes that the body or some kind of corporeality purports to speak for the entire body, right? Or to say what one is, right? But speaking about what Dr. Holloway said about the law, Charles Chestnut has an interesting essay. It's like in the 1890s called "What is a White Man?" Right? And it's a tongue-in-cheek kind of approach to to defining what is so-called mulatto and what is white and what is Black. And he talks about how there are certain cases where women have been known to have some kind of African ancestry, but if they had some sort of wealth, then the law would overlook the fact that of what their pedigree was, right? And so what we know from his essay, despite the fact that it was tongue-in-cheek, what we know from the essay is that at the end of the day, it is whatever serves white folks the most, right? If it serves white folks the most for you to be Black, then that is what you are, right? And so to your point, Dr. Green, to your point about having this woman disrobe in a courtroom, right? Like they would never have done that to someone they knew for sure or even thought was white, right? Because laws are meant to protect white maidenhood, so they would never have done that, right? And so what Charles Chestnut is arguing is that there is a so-called disability of color, or I would argue an ability of a lack of color for these people to skirt these boundaries of identity.
Mhm. So let's talk a little bit more about the relationship between Claire and Brian, which we see, I think, is the strands are pulled out. I get a sense that there's tension in their marriage through reading the novel. So it's interesting to see them on screen and to hear Brian say some things in the film that he doesn't have these parts in the novel. So we see so much more from Brian. We hear so much more. When we first see them together, it's after she's seen Claire, and then she comes in, Brian is sleeping, and she kisses him. Every time we see them, there's something different taking place. This is a good question. I'm sort of going here. I have these in my questions as well. Does Claire cause this rupture between Brian and Irene, or is there something already there that Claire perhaps exacerbates by her presence? What is that relationship, this threesome? Because it actually literally is at points in this film. So who wants to start with that? Dr. Ramon.
There is something already there, and I think Claire just worsens it. Her presence exacerbates it. So, Brian makes a comment regularly, sex is just a joke. There's always this thread line about humor and joking. And to him, sex and their intimacy, their relationship is just a joke because his needs are not met. His needs are not met sexually. His needs are not met when he said he wanted to go to Brazil years ago, and Irene just stopped the idea. She was not in favor of that idea. I get the sense that there always has some tension there between Irene and Brian. And with Claire's presence, he seems to be moving away slowly from his wife, Irene, and gradually going towards Claire. And there are moments of intimacy where they're laughing, again, just through a line of humor. They're laughing, they're talking. In one of the final scenes, one of the characters says, you're like a painting, you're like a portrait over there. Like you've just been holding for the past couple minutes throughout this party. So that with Claire's presence, she just exacerbates problems that are already there. There's long-standing tension. Brian is completely unhappy in his marriage. He feels stifled, but Claire just adds to that when she appears, when she comes into the picture. I would even say, in addition to that, there's some elements of jealousy there. When we talk about humor and joking, he looks at that letter, the letter when he's in bed with Irene, and he giggles. Giggle is not the right word, but he he reads this letter, and it's a very intimate letter from a friend to his wife, and he's looking at it like, I don't even know how to read this letter.
It's so good.
Yeah, we need to talk more about that, him reading the letter, because that's a change from the novel. So it's significant, but I'm gonna go to Dr. Betts and then Dr. Charles Lennon.
Yeah, I do feel like, the novel definitely hints at, Irene thinking about infidelity and thinking that it's a possibility. But then I think it really hit me as a viewer of the film that when Claire just automatically assumes, of course, I'd come to live in Harlem with you. And then you see that look come over Irene's face, like, oh, like, I really felt for her as a person. But even when I went back, I looked at the novel today again, and I kept thinking about that moment in the opening paragraph where they describe the letter. And the letter itself even it's like it's announcing that something unwelcome and maybe even just a little bit odd is coming into their lives. Like they say, after her other ordinary and clearly directed letters, the long envelope of thin Italian paper with its almost illegible scrawl seemed out of place and alien. And there was, too, something mysterious and slightly furtive about it, a thin, sly thing, which bore no return address to betray the sender. not that she hadn't immediately known who the sender was. So you already know there's like some subterfuge, even just in how this letter looks. And it's these really little subtle hints where you get pulled in, and some of them are lost in the movie and some of them are portrayed really well.
Yeah, I messed up the line. Actually, Dr. Holloway's hand was up and then Charles Lennon.
Oh, that's good. It was, I was going to say that the letter introduces the queerness that we know, thanks to Dr. Debbie McDowell, and those of us who read the 86 Rutgers edition, said, oh my gosh, I've been reading this novel all wrong. This is a queer. So when I wrote this novel, A Death in Harlem, which takes up at the point of Death by Misadventure, I started out with Irene and Claire as my characters. I had to change their names, although the events are the same. So what does happen? Does she jump? Is she pushed? Does she fall? But it all builds on these little hints you're talking about. Brian's wish for something different than the likeness of his wife. Irene's wish for something more intimate with her husband, and yet at the same time pushing her friend towards her husband. So, you know, Larsen gives us enough ways to wonder about this novel, where somebody could take up and write the novel that comes after it and says what had happened was, you know. So it's only because Larsen left all of these dangling prepositions almost that allowed me to take up really with that question when Felice goes up and says, careful, you're the only white man here. And I'm thinking, are you sure? Are you sure? You know, so everybody might be hiding a secret. And so that introduction of secrets gives us a way as readers, and me a way as a first-time novelist, to imagine, so what if there were more secrets than Larsen? What if there were the secrets that Larsen hinted?
I was just going to mention that when Brian is reading the letter and he has this moment, he has this moment where he's looking at his wife like, you know, and he says something like, stay far away from her or something to that effect. I think, and which that portion doesn't happen in the novel that I can recall. But the thing I find interesting about it, the way they've done it in the film, is that it sort of sends us home with the idea that like we're supposed to read queerness here. Like if you don't, in case you didn't get it in the novel, let me tell you, this is a queer moment, or at least he's recognizing it too. And I think he's also looking at her, he's looking at his wife in the moment and saying, there's something I don't know about her either. Like I don't know her as well as I thought I did, even though he's resenting her for being there. And so I don't think that there is a desire, and you guys can feel free to disagree with me here. I don't think that he necessarily desires Claire in any kind of way other than sort of flirtatiously, because he could have left his wife long time ago when she didn't want to move to Brazil, or when she didn't want something, when she was overprotective of the boys, or all of these things, right? And but he is also firm in his Black identity, right? And so I don't know that he want to situate himself with Claire, who is haphazard with hers.
Dr. Nero?
Yeah, one of the things I found very fascinating about this, because we keep talking about the color and everything like that, and whether or not these women can pass, do they look obviously identifiably white, or are they mixed race? But it was, to me, one of the things that was very interesting about that is when I began to look at the film and look at Irene and Brian's children, and how the boys were so identifiably Black as opposed to mixed. And I was like, this is very interesting. And why is this what is this? And so Brian has this attachment. He's concerned he doesn't leave them. And, you know, of course he's not. I just don't think he's going to leave Irene for the haphazard Claire with his sons. But I think that the filmmaker made a very deliberate decision about positioning the boys, at least skin color wise, with Brian and not with Irene, or at least not even appearing to be a mixture of the two of them. I was quite that was quite stunning and surprising to me. And the other point that I wanted to mention was about what the film then does with the queerness of the women, because that letter is so, when my students read, they all go like, "Ooh, this is hot." you know, um, and but the film then displaces that queerness into other places, and especially the nightclub. If I may show you just another little 20-second clip.
Okay.
I'll share my screen again.
Oh, yeah.
Now, this is your man.
Wow. You'll do. Come along.
That's the scene.
So
I love that moment because
yeah.
then it's like Irene is coming out, but then and Claire seems receptive, but then when Brian shows up, Claire ends it. She removes her hand, snatches it away.
And
so I find
that's the second time actually that they touch hands, right? Because the first time is that the Drayton? I don't know if they call it that in the film.
Yeah.
But because the geography isn't represented the same in the film as it is in the novel. But so, you know, Claire, for those of you all, I've watched it a couple of times. I watched it just before this event, but she reaches out to her, Claire does, on the table, and of course she's like, "No, don't touch me." And then she reaches out to her as Charles. So that's the second time we see this hand grabbing that occurs. Now, Dr. Ramon, you had your hand up. Did you lose your thought, or do you still want to say something?
You said my thought, actually.
Okay.
I thought that's part two of that, where you just basically summed it up. We saw in an earlier scene, that's exactly what we saw, where the reversal happened. Claire touched Irene and she pulled herself away. Now we see it, and again, pulling away from the physical touch.
Okay, Dr. Betts, and then there's something else that I want to bring up about this marriage too that I noticed. Dr. Betts?
Yeah, the thing that touched me the most about the film and how it kind of played up a lot of these dramas and conflicts was how Hall used these non-diegetic elements to really make you see the tension that Irene was experiencing. Like, I kept catching not so much the crack in the wall, I remember the crack in the wall, but thinking about how they used the piano solos. And almost every time you saw the back of Irene's head, one of those piano solos comes in, and they become a little bit more long, they get longer and they get a little bit more fraught sounding until she's on that couch and she asks for the ginger ale with the 3 drops of scotch, I believe it is. So by then you don't hear them anymore, but it's like those, as soon as you know that piano solo is coming, it's coming. And then the light too. Like the first one I noticed was when she leaves the hotel room, the Drayton, and the door closes and all you see is her in the hallway, and there's this bright light behind her head, and that's when you hear the first piano solo. And the lighting just keeps changing, you know, and then her costuming, like that first scene when she passes, she's wearing something that looks very light colored white, of course, because it's a hot day, but it's like all of her wardrobing later on is dark. And like you see her in these dark rooms in the house, or it's like the shadows hit her differently. It's not as much light anymore. So there's a lot of visual tropes that Hall really uses in a really exciting way to make you feel that drama heighten in such a short story.
Yeah. In terms of the threesome, I also want to point out that every time we see them in the bed together, Claire is there. So the first time is when he reads the letter and he pauses, and then he said, you know, after he says the wild desire. So again, we can talk more about why Brian reads the letter and not Claire. And then the second time we see them in bed together, it's after they have had this party and she's talking about how beautiful Claire is. Don't you think she's beautiful, and so on. And the third and last time we see them in the bed together, is she on drugs? What's going on with that? But she's like tossing around in the bed and she sees Claire at the bedside. And then we see Brian. This is where I'm like, what is this, a threesome? What is this? Because every time they're in this bed, yes, we see the crack, but Claire is there in some way in this bed. So y'all look at that.
But what do you think about, Tara, what do you think about the fact that that second time when Irene is talking about how lovely, how beautiful Claire is, and she asks Brian, you know, oh, don't you think she's lovely? And then Brian immediately turns it into Brian racializes it and says, no, I like my women dark.
This is her, who's a light-skinned woman who can pass for white and has when we first see her, right?
Yes, I'm like, what does this mean?
Yeah, what woman are you talking about? Yes, Dr. Holloway.
Brian is a mixed-up fool. First, I want to say the crack is growing, which for one, I'm just watching that crack and what shape it's going to have. I just want to bow down to Rebecca Hall's cinematography and the play of light. They could teach, what was his name back in the 20s? Alfred Hitchcock, some stuff about light and shadows, because that is almost a character in the movie.
Yeah.
I love the way you trace the development of her wardrobe. Wardrobe gets an award too, for that, from that filmy to that very stiff black dress that she wears at the end. But one of the things that I think Larsen opens up for us is to play with Brian's messiness. You know, I like my women dark. So the mystery in, this has been called a historical mystery, A Death in Harlem. The mystery is Brian having an affair with his wife's best friend? Because at the same time, he says things like, I like my women dark. And so it opens up a question for exactly, and the Brazil part, which I always have to explain to students, is that was seen as the racial paradise where color didn't matter. We were just all, you know, so Brian's desires are not coherent because he's incoherent. And he doesn't even know who he's married to and what she wants. So I think Larsen opened up for me to become a mystery writer in a sense, because she leaves all these dangling, you know, are you the only white man here? What does Brian want? Who's having an affair with whom? And does she jump, fall, or is pushed? All of these things are unanswered questions in this tiny little, we used to call it a novella. Remember, Charles, when we first started teaching, it was a novella, and now it's a novel, you know, but I think it's that openness which gives it a nearly 100-year history, you know, half the time at the Langston Hughes Society.
I think Nero, Betts, are your hands just still up from the last?
Oh, I'm sorry. I should lower my hand. I'm sorry.
Okay.
My mistake.
Dr. Charles Lennon.
I was going to say, Brian also, when he says something to the effect of like, she would be an unusually, when he's referring to Claire, I think she'd be an unusually beautiful white woman, right? And this is a conversation I think that is fair among Black folk who know of people who are passing and that kind of thing. And I think he's trying to also reassure his wife in a particular way that she's no more beautiful than you are, right? Even if there was some kind of sexual desire, which I still am on the fence about whether or not there is, I lean toward that there is not between Brian and Claire. In fact, when they're coming down the when Irene is coming down the stairs and she looks at the both of them and they're laughing laughing in what appears to be an intimate moment. Once we get downstairs, we see that they're actually much further apart than they appear to be in the mirror. And so I think part of what Hall and even Larsen are getting at here is that there's a perception thing happening, and from Irene's gaze, there is something intimate that could be unfolding, but she's also projecting a bit, right? Because she has a desire for Claire too, and so she understands why someone would be so attracted to her. And so I do like the way, Dr. Green, you framed it insofar as like, oh, this is a threesome happening, because there's always a kind of rupture that is occurring. And I've always thought it interesting, particularly in the book, but also in the film, how Claire seems to have very little boundaries in general, right? And I think the novel calls it, it says she has a cat-like way or a having way. And so she can be in all of these different spaces and still find comfort in the boys' room or playing with the boys, or but the thing I found most striking is her being in a couple's bedroom, right? Like that's not something typically socially we would do. If our friends came over, they don't come to our bedroom. That's a sort of strange way of making yourself at home. But she occupies all these spaces because she has been passing for so long, right? And so she knows how to perform in these spaces. And I think not having a sense of boundaries, particularly when it comes to her childhood friend who will give her whatever she wants anyway. And if I could, for a second, jump back to when you guys were talking about the multiple times that they had touched hands. One is there's a conversation happening between them. There's a yes and a no, a push and a pull. And so when Irene touches Claire's hand, that second time, when she touches her hand, she's letting her know, yes, I am open to this, right? And so when she jerks away, it's supposed to be furtive. It's supposed to be something that other people don't see. And so because there's some kind of subterfuge happening, you can't be this forward about it. And so she jerks away, not so much as to say no, as much as to say, this has got to be secret.
It's the closet. She
Absolutely.
creates the closet.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, Claire, first of all, just full disclosure, my students know this. I find Claire to be the most fascinating, and this does not include any of Toni Morrison's characters. So I'm just gonna take Toni Morrison out of it. But I find Claire to be the most fascinating character in literature. I do. I have to teach passing. Claire is just fascinating to me. So I'm just so happy to see her on and in this film, and to hear the actress say that she had so much fun playing her. Because I think she does a fabulous job, and just sort of, the way that she flirts with people and the way that she makes people nervous. And she just has this way of perform, and she chases this woman around in her own house and makes her uncomfortable. How does that happen?
That was so uncomfortable.
Your house, right? So the fact that she has this kind of power that she's not ashamed of in any particular way, and an ability to use that to draw attention to herself. And then we don't, partly, could she have jumped out of the window? Could she have been, is this motive to push her out of the window, or so on?
Not. Yes, you may push me. There was an exchange of glances in that.
Yes.
What shall I do? Yeah, go ahead, push me out. So is that what's going on? But I like your focus on the intimate spaces, because I got very uncomfortable. My grandmother's training came back to me when she invited her up to her suite at the Drayton. You know, at first we see the messy bed, and I said, "You're not supposed to be in somebody's hotel suite, and then you're not supposed to sit on somebody. We weren't supposed to sit in your outside clothes on the bed." All of these mores that we grew up with about what happened in intimate spaces and who was allowed in. I remember getting fussed out by an elderly cousin in Birmingham, inviting somebody into my bedroom who had, it was a girl, who was visiting the house. You don't invite people past the living room. So there was a violation of spaces that Claire kept intruding into. I love the way you say she was chasing her around her own house, including the kitchen and the outside.
Yeah, just because she keeps moving and she's just like right behind her on her heels.
Like a cat.
Yeah.
On a hot tin roof.
Unless she goes into the kitchen, she's everywhere. So,
I mean,
but I want to go back to Dr. Nero. In one of your clips, you asked about the gaze, and we really should talk about the perspective of this. Hall says that a big challenge for her was actually capturing the perspective. It's not in first person, right? But can we trust, to what extent can we trust Irene? We do know that she's largely responsible for what we feel, what we know, what we see, what we experience. And this Irene conversation with Hugh at the Negro League event, she says to him that things are not always as they seem. So we know that Hall is definitely playing with this perspective, with the gaze, with the look. How does Hall capture this, that sort of the perspective that's not exactly straight and focused as we see at the very beginning of the film? Dr. Charles Lennon.
Okay, so I have feelings about this scene. Okay,
Okay.
For a couple of reasons. One, no Black person is going to tell a white person in so many words that this person is passing, right? Like that would be not just a social no-no, but it would bring harm theoretically to that person's body. And Black folk believed, even with the enterprise, the cultural phenomenon of racial crossing, Black folk believe in the preservation of the body. They preserve moments of freedom, moments of movement, right? And so no Black person is going to then say to a white man, yeah, things aren't what they say, like, so that he'll get enough to get this, right? And even though Hall says something to the effect of, they know because there are multiple things happening in this scene, so you're not going to tell on her because I have something on you. Well, then his loyalty would be to you and not to Claire. And so that disruption never would have happened. But then there's also the moment, because even in the character, Hughes' character, who I liken a lot to Karl Van Vechten, who was known to travel these spaces, and these spaces were oftentimes known to be spaces full of like queer folk, right?
And it's dedicated actually to Van Vechten.
Right, and the novel is dedicated to Van Vechten, and the reason that the novel is called Passing instead of being called Nig, which was its original title, is because Karl Van Vechten had already written his book with a pejorative title and in effect Broken Harlem, and so he and Nella Larsen remain friends, and so she has to change the title of her novel. And so the Hugh character is very much a Karl Van Vechten character who is also a queer man whose wife who is married to a woman. So there's no way that, and now mind you, if we read Irene as sort of a Nella Larsen kind of character, which some scholars do, then yes, we could see their friendship. She might have said something, but even then she likely wouldn't have, right? Because the furtive nature of passing, which means we have to protect the passer's body. That's just, we have to preserve their body. And so the fact that Hall gives us this moment where she all but tells him, yes, she's a Black woman, is very interesting to me. And it also is, I think, a small failure here, right? And I'm interested to know what y'all think about that.
I was wondering if you would see it as an error the way I did, because I think you're right that, this was the unspoken covenant. We don't tell, and we don't tell for the protection of the community as well as the protection of that body. It's what frankly gave me room to play with the character. I call him Hughes Wellington in my book, the white man in my book, because of this enigma around him. And the fact that she brings him into the community. I mean, he acts like he's interested in everybody anyway, like the National Geographic magazine kind of thing. which is okay. We allowed those folks knowingly into our communities at night to enjoy the exotic rhythms of Harlem, but nobody would have told. And I do think that's an error of confidence, which shows up as an error of the writers not quite getting how far we could take this, or we would take this.
Dr. Betts?
I think you guys kind of tread some of the ground that I was thinking of, but I did find myself, I had trepidation with that scene, but I'm also thinking about, we forget, even if it wasn't Harlem, there have often been these scenarios where it's a Black scene or a Black community where people hang out. And there's always that one white person who is kind of like a fly on the wall who sees everything. Even in my grandparents' tavern, which was in a Black neighborhood, there was always the one white guy, Bernie, who was sitting in the corner. And when we kind of discount that those people have always been there and they're privy to conversations, even if they're not directly in the conversation, then we kind of discount that conversation does happen. What I did enjoy is that Hugh didn't become a central figure or become the narrator of the story, which often happens in stories about any community of color in cinematic history. And I'm kind of happy that that doesn't happen. But also, I just kind of feel like at this point, maybe it's because of Hugh's queerness and the fact that he's around all the time and they have this level of intimacy. And you do see she kind of says it surreptitiously, like she's kind of like this. Like I felt like it was believable, even though it was like, I don't know if that would really happen.
It reminds me, I'm sorry, am I talking out of turn here by any chance? Did somebody else want to speak? It reminds me in a very curious. It reminds me in a very curious way. I was thinking about an earlier film, Julie Dash's Illusions, and in that film we have the Lynette McKee, who I wish she had played in this. I wish someone had done passing for her, but anyway, that's another story. But Lynette McKee plays this motion picture aspiring executive, and the young woman who is the housekeeper comes in to the office and immediately recognizes that she's Black, that Lynette McKee is Black. And they have a conversation together, and the Black woman tells her, that the servant tells her, oh, yeah, we can always tell, who is and who isn't. And then Lynette McKee her character reveals that what she wants to do is she wants to change the images of Black people in Hollywood film. And so she's politically engaged and committed. I always felt very uncomfortable in Julie Dash's in that film, because I kept thinking to myself, well, why would the Black woman who's the maid keep this secret? What does she have other than some kind of, I guess, race loyalty? And what is that race loyalty? And so it always made me feel uncomfortable. In this scene, I didn't feel that uncomfortable. I felt like that's Irene I felt like Irene's disclosure humanized her. It made her not just blindly take race loyalty. It's like, I wish I had known more what she had to gain from this from Hughes' confidence, getting his confidence. But nevertheless, I felt it kind of humanized her.
Could you say that it was the beginning of the unraveling of her loyalty to Claire? Because one of the things that she depends on is that race loyalty. But
yes.
The only thing Irene has going for her at this point, the woman's coming after her husband, her children, her family, her whatever.
Her maid.
Her maid, the household, the help, So what she's doing is just saying, I'm just going to put a little, unloosen a little stitch here, because I do have a little bit of power. I know something you don't want folks to know, which later on becomes, well, let me just hang up the phone. And I couldn't reach you to tell you that your husband ran into me and Philippe arm in arm on the street. So maybe it's the unraveling of her loyalty, but I don't think she was not strategic there.
Yes.
I think this was, I got some power too. I got something I can say. Let me tell you about what you think you know.
And to me, that humanized Irene.
Mm-hmm.
I could see where you guys are coming from, but in order for that to work, in order for that to be the case, if that's her moment of unraveling, that loyalty unraveling, then she would have to be sure that Hugh would disclose that information. Otherwise, it would make no difference, right? Which means that there is, it's not just her disclose. It would matter to whom she disclosed, right? Because
I think it partly depends on, she thinks Hugh won't tell anybody, because Hughes, like tight with the race. So she just tells somebody is enough. Not that she expects Hughes to go out and tell, but I've just let a little bit loose, but I haven't pulled the whole seam loose.
And so,
I'm sorry, it's like the epistemology of the closet. And now we're both in this closet together and we have this little secret.
Right, and I would agree with that, except I would, so if I agree with what Dr. Holloway is saying, that like, I'm not gonna go too far, but I am gonna drop this little tidbit just so I can feel some sort of relief, then either way, she is either relying on a loyalty from Hugh that has not otherwise been proven, or she's relying on him to tell, on whatever the case is.
I agree.
Either way, what we have is, I think, if she did tell him on purpose, then there's a strategy here at play. And if she didn't tell him on purpose, then I think it's a failure on the part of the film to give it to him that way.
Mm-hmm. I think it's possible to look at that, and I'm going to transition into another question, but to if in some way she feels as though she's a victim, at least in the novel, and to some degree in this film, and I want us to talk a little bit about that, then this is a resistance to victimhood, right? By sort of playing with the power of the truth that she has, that knowledge. So because again, she's the one really that she becomes responsible for the husband knowing that she is Black, and that there was a Black person in his room, Black person who has clearly had some sort of relationship with his wife. Now we'll have to sit down and really think about, how did he know where she was? I want to go right, because he didn't just happen to see it on the internet that that his wife was, Facebook photos or got tagged that she was at this party with all these Black people. So,
especially not on a party this intimate.
He wasn't walking by and saw her in the window. So she had to have told him. But I want to talk about this alienation, going back to the sense of victimhood, this alienation that seems to occur throughout the film, and is quite pronounced in ways that I don't think that it is in the novel. I could be wrong about that. What do you all think about how and why Hall makes alienation so pronounced in this film? And I'm really thinking more about Irene. It could be other characters also, but I'm certainly thinking about Irene.
I would say in Irene's case, when we think about alienation, we might think about it in terms of passing. Claire is the character we assume is passing throughout the whole text, right? When it comes to alienation, Irene is alienated as well. In her marriage, I would say, when it comes to her children, and, she's trying to alienate herself from Claire, but clearly, as you said, Dr. Green, Claire's still tracing her around her house, trying to find her friend and whatever. I would say that alienation is very important when it comes to Irene, because she too is feeling alienated. We can't just say Claire is alienated because of her jumping the color line. What about Irene? Her marriage, her relationship to motherhood, all of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Dr. Betts.
Yeah, I kind of feel like too, you see the alienation definitely on Irene's part, because she's a race woman. Like you see her, she's dutiful and obligated, not just as a wife and a mother, but she's like, I do, like, even there's that moment where she's reading The Crisis in bed. And I'm just like,
I love that.
sorry. If Andre Holland was in the bed with me, I doubt that I would do the same.
Come on.
But what I'm going to say is that, you know, it's like, what does, and you see that start to deteriorate in the film as well. Like she starts smoking cigarettes. She's like, her clothing definitely changes. We've already talked about that. But it's like her questioning of all of that dutifulness starts to break down in the film a lot more. And I'm like, I wonder if it's because she's looking at Claire and she's like, Claire does whatever she wants. She don't even know where her daughter is. You know? And you know, in most communities, you would be like, you don't know where your children are at. What kind of mother are you? So I think those things are really important to note too, because then you know, oh snap, Irene is probably realizing Claire doesn't have any boundaries.
Yeah.
Anything could happen.
Right.
You know, and I think it ties well together to make those characters be continuous, because the one factor that changes everything, you know, Claire is the stranger that comes to town, and that's how everything begins to shift.
And so then, do we trust her? I mean, going back to my previous question, Julia, you're saying no. And when I say trust her, I mean Irene. But can we, if we don't trust her, can we empathize with this feeling of alienation?
Right. I think, so here's the thing. Even in the novel, she's not reliable as a narrator. And I think that is important, right? We get a lot of her interiority, which we don't necessarily get in the film, so much so that when my wife and I were watching it, my wife said something like, now granted, she's a psychologist, so, but she said, is she depressed? What is happening? Why? Like the film itself is already dark and she's balled up in the bed and she's doing all of these things that are sort of listless and lifeless to a degree, right? But in the novella, what we get is there are these moments of her interiority where the author lets us know she wondered about this thing about passing. And she says, it's a funny thing about passing. Sometimes we disapprove of it, but at times we condone it, right? It excites our contempt, but we rather admire it, right? She talks about this duality of wanting to know about passing. And then she says something later in the book, she says something like, for the first time, she woke up and realized or wished she had not been born Black, right? And these were these moments that we don't necessarily get in the film or can't necessarily get in the film. And so I think in that way, she's not very reliable. In fact, we ask questions when we're watching the film. For example, when Dr. Green asks, why is she following this woman around her house like this? Like this is, but she's also quite literally chasing Blackness, right? Like she's chasing this thing that she does not necessarily have. And at the same time, it seems that Irene is running from a supposed kind of whiteness, right? Because her husband even says something to her, like in the film, he says something like, he's tired of playing second fiddle to her Negro League, right? And so race matters to her. And so we know that even given the option, she would not necessarily pass, but she is certainly questioning her various duties, right? They seem humdrum to her. And so I think that in that way, she's sort of unreliable.
Or are those duties, particularly with the league, are they performative of Blackness? Dr. Ramon.
So to answer your previous question about empathy, I would say I think the novel or the movie does an excellent job of showing empathy for Irene. And the way I see it is through the things that are cracking. Her marriage is cracking, the flower pot out the window cracks. When she's at the party, I think it's a teapot that cracks. She's always dropping something. Something's always cracking. When I think of those images, I see those as a metaphor for her life, always cracking and always falling apart. Seeing along the same plane, I would say that the movie does a good job of showing us we could empathize with Irene, given that her whole life is falling apart, like the physical things she has in her hands.
And actually, Hall does talk about that in an interview. At a certain point, I began to think about quicksand,
Mhm.
because Irene really seems to be losing her mind by the point we see her in the bed with the bottles turned over on the side of the bed. And then there was the reference earlier to the son saying, "Are you going to take a nap?" And this is like, he asked her if she's going to sleep when they're looking for Claire. So you know, I don't know if there's a suggestion that she's addicted to these, whatever these pills are, or Dr. Holloway.
Yeah, I actually ended up doing some research on drugs, on the drugs that you would take for self-palliation during that period.
Mhm.
And I suspect that what she has is what was once used as a sleeping potion. It's called Verona. And Verona can be overused and abused too. So this sort of sleepy state and this bottle, which looked very much like the bottles that I researched for A Death in Harlem, were the ones that upper class women used to just kind of float by their lives. Remember, this was the age, although I thought liquor was used very interestingly in the film.
Yeah.
This is the age of prohibition. So all of this liquor is illegal as well. And yet the ways around this are one of the ways that the film sort of indicates there are things going on subtextually as well. So I think it was Verona, and I think it was exactly as you and your wife saw.
Dr. Nero?
Yeah. One of the things I want to do another screen share, but not to show a moving image, but a still image, because one of the things, and I might be going just a little bit too far ahead here, I was so intrigued by Hall's cinematography, her use of black and white. And initially I was thinking, this is just, it's just so beautiful. And the ways in which, for example, there were all of these images of of James Van Der Zee that were being called to my mind, and his images of Harlem, 1920s Harlem. At one point, I just kind of expected it. At some point, I thought we were going to see, like, you know, some kind of big UNIA parade or something. You know? It's like, whoa! But then there's also something else, and I think that's what I want to call attention to. There's something kind of, I guess I'm going to say, a fetishistic gaze, because I noticed this when in that scene I played with Claire and Zulena, and and I kept trying to think, what does it remind me of? And this is what it reminds me of. It reminds me of Robert Mapplethorpe's work. I'll share with you. And this is and so I kept thinking about, you know, this use of black and white, and I still haven't put my finger on it per se, but it just struck me as both that Hall and Mapplethorpe have this fetishistic desire to think about skin and black and white, in the use of black and white photography, to think about skin and difference and desire. And that's kind of all I have to say about that for right now.
Yeah.
Forthcoming essay somewhere.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I'll say you should do it. So, Dr. Holloway.
Oh, that's a leftover handout.
Before. So we get to the end of the film. There's a strategically placed arm in the novel. It's a little bit different in the physicality. There's a hand on the arm and then a body out the window. This is around the waist, as there's a lunging from the husband. Wasn't he the one that was the vampire in every time I see him, he's always lunging. He plays those kinds of characters, violent characters. So what did you all think of?
Oh yeah, the HBO series, yes.
Yeah, with the vampire.
True Love. True Love.
Yeah.
It's Eric from True Blood.
True Blood,
scary.
not True Love.
Swedish
He's
cat.
but he's in another series where he's abusive as well. But in any case, so he's typecast at this point. But in any case, what are you all's responses to how the death of Claire was portrayed by the film? Did it capture what you think Nella Larsen was trying to do, and what got you, Karla, to sit down and say, finally, I feel like there needs to be a part 2 to this?
Well, I gotta say, I don't think there should be a part 2. I went back and purposefully looked at the end of the book because I was like, wait a second, because it didn't seem clear in the novel. And again, like you said, Dr. Green, there's like a physicality that kind of mirrors, but not quite what they show in the movie. But I think they do make it look more like Claire pushed her out the window in this movie. And I mean, it's satisfying for the movie, but I like the ambiguity of the book because we don't, I mean, imagine if somebody was found out and confronted, and you don't know what's going to be the outcome of your financial life, your sexual life, and Karla's point in her book, Miss Dr. Karla. So
and the police come and arrest somebody. And,
right. So
and what if they're wrong?
And then I could believe, I had to rewind that scene. I looked at it and rewinded it like 3 or 4 times. And I was like, you see the hand, but you don't see her touch her. You don't see her push her, but you also don't see how easy it would have been for Claire to just step back.
It was a protective hand too. She could have
been
keeping her husband away from her because her husband was lunging, don't come near her. This is mine.
And then you can't tell by the way she's laying on the ground, because I started looking at how she was laying. Because if she's falling back,
she was.
So you do an investigation. I love it.
Right. I wanted to go forensic with it. I'm like, she probably would have landed on her back if somebody pushed her back. But she's like on her side.
I am not here just to promote the book, but I do deal with, if you fall out the window, what is the body going to look like?
Yeah.
What position is it going to be in? Because she's in the wrong position. Fall back, fall forward, Just saying, the CSI of it.
Yeah, how does she go out? Yeah, I mean, but it's just so, it's beautiful though. I'm surprised Charles will probably have a clip of it somewhere in your library.
Actually, I do.
It's so, to me, it's just so beautiful because it moves quickly, but even just that frame, she's wearing the satin, Claire's wearing the satin dress, and it does look protective, the arm around the waist. I mean, it would remind me of something my mother might do. If somebody were lunging at me, she would either jump in front or I can see someone grabbing someone around the waist and pulling them.
If you were in a car, and before there were seat belts, and if a kid was in the car, we used to put our hands like this and we break suddenly.
And she still does that, actually. Dr. Ramon.
Yeah, so I agree. The ending of the movie was beautiful, but I think Nella Larsen wanted it to be that way. I think that Rebecca Hall certainly took creative license, and it's Hollywood, so you have to end it somehow that's going to satisfy your audience. It's Hollywood in 2021. I was not necessarily satisfied. I think it was beautifully done, yes, but I was not satisfied in terms of fidelity to Nella Larsen's novel. Passing is famously ambiguous. It is famously ambiguous, and the novel ends with, did she jump? Was she pushed? And if she was pushed, was it by Irene or was it by racist, Bellew? Who pushed, or did she jump? Questions about the ambiguity of the story, the denouement of the story, that the movie itself, with Irene's hand on her waist, which is a very intimate thing to do, put around that area of the body, did Irene push her? And if she did, was she pushing her because she wanted to protect her, to save her, or was she pushing her out of pure jealousy? I'm not sure that the movie did Nella Larsen justice by having what appears to be Irene push Claire out the window. I don't necessarily think Nella Larsen intended for that to happen. That said, I think that the ending was beautifully done, but I just don't know if Nella Larsen would have liked it that way. my 2 cents.
Yes.
I'm going to go ahead and echo what you said, right? Like at the end of the, for those of us who are very familiar with the novel, the moment the window opens in that scene, we're all like, oh, it's about to go down.
Yeah.
And so I had expected maybe a cutaway from that moment or something that was that Hall didn't necessarily deliver on there. I think it was a little bit not as ambiguous as it needed to be from the title of the novel to the different questions that the characters ask throughout the novel to the famously ambiguous ending. I think we needed that ending to remain the way it did in the novel, right? For fidelity to the author. But I think taking creative license in that way, even from the location of Irene's arm around her, right? It's like, it could be protective and sure, but it seemed quite a bit more intimate than just protective. And I found that interesting. And also in the film, how her husband gets close to her, but not quite as close as it appeared he got in the novel.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like, well, his arm length has got to be something ridiculous if that man pushed her from there, right? And so I think we needed some more of the ambiguity. And I was a little bit, I will say, disappointed might be strong, but not quite satisfied with the ending the way the film did it.
Honestly, it doesn't feel ambiguous to me in the novel. It just seems to me that Irene did it and that she's confessing and going through it. Should I go downstairs? Should I? And I just reread it before.
Yeah, you're right about
logging on. It just doesn't feel as ambiguous over the years. I really feel convinced that Irene. Feels guilty.
Dr. Green,
and she doesn't want to be taught.
I will say the more I teach it, Dr. Green. I will say the
Charles, you'll just have to deal with it. That's how I feel about it.
I agree with you there, though. I agree with you there.
Yeah, Tara, is your hand up?
I just there were a couple things that I just wanted to mention briefly. I feel like one, I'm not completely surprised that they chose to remove the epithet from what the husband says in the end, where he calls her a dirty, filthy liar. Like you almost expect him to say what they actually say in the book, which is the N word, and he doesn't. And I understand in 2021, most people would be like, "Why would they say that?" And be like, if you read the book, that's what Larsen actually says in the book. And to me, it diffuses some of the charge in that epithet, but it also dehistoricizes the narrative a little bit, because we know what he would have actually said.
Yes.
And then also too, I wasn't really surprised by the black and white choice. As somebody who, everybody who knows me knows I'm Black, but there's been times when I show up, they just automatically see my skin color and my hair texture, and they're like, "Hey, what's this white girl doing here?" And I'm like, however, whenever I've done a black and white photograph as opposed to a full color photograph, the responses vary. Because I look very much like my paternal grandmother, who was obviously a brown-skinned Black woman. And I think sometimes when you see that black and white film, it creates that ambiguity in a way. Because all you're seeing is, okay, you might look at the shape of the nose, the shape of the lips, the fullness of the face, or something like that. And I feel like because of the way they kind of styled Nega and Thompson, you don't see that as much. Like there's
It was so important. That hat was doing a lot of work.
That hat was work.
I will say there were a ton of people who had at least on my timeline, and these are all Black folk, who had comments about, now we know these folks are Black, like why on earth would they choose? But I think there's a work that Rebecca Hall, whether knowingly or not, did here by casting 2 Black women to play mixed race women who pass for white, right? Because historically, especially in cinema, these characters are always played by non-Black, usually white women characters. And so she disrupts that one-way concession of unmediated access, white unmediated access to Blackness, right? And I thought that was a pretty, and it would have to be in Black and white in order for it to translate, right? Because not just is there, will they read as Black, if it's in color, right? But also I think that there is a kind of one, an ambiguity that she's leaning on, but two, what she wants to do is to kind of what we start doing is leaning on those phenotypic kind of, we're leaning on what does the nose look like? What does around the eyes look like? What are the ears look? All of these things that we consider identifying markers that we can't necessarily do in Black and white, right? And so what she does is give two Black women actresses the opportunity to do a thing that historically they aren't allowed to do. And then on the other hand, she also takes away from the viewer this moment where we would be questioning, particularly Black viewers, where we're saying we could tell, we can always tell, that kind of thing. And I thought she did that pretty well.
Yeah.
When I first heard, I'm sorry.
No, I was just saying, I'm really glad that one, there were Black actors who got to infuse that role when it's basically what you said, just that doesn't always happen. In fact, how many times have white actors just been cast outright as Black people? If you think about Imitation of Life, or I believe Pinky, and what was the other film I was
Imitation of Life, Pinky,
Showboat.
Lena Horne complained about this throughout her entire career, for example.
Right.
And even especially with Showboat, because Lena Horne had played a small role as a white woman in Showboat before. And so when she didn't get the role in Showboat, in the larger production of Showboat, it was telling but the person they had to play her role in Showboat, they actually gave her Lena Horne records so that she could act it the way that Lena Horne would have done it, right?
Ava Gardner.
Right. And she and Ava Gardner were friends. And so Ava Gardner complained to her, why didn't they just give you the part, But I think that Hall here does something special, I think, for Black actors. And I think that's laudable.
Absolutely.
Agree.
Yeah, I agree too.
Yeah, and I think something to keep in mind too is that we are dealing with mixed race. I think both of them are mixed race actresses, right? They get cast in, well, at least Thompson certainly does. Nega is British, so I don't know as much about her history of film, but I can remember Thompson. Many of us will go back to what was the movie when they were in the college, and she's actually sort of passing for Black in a way that she's denying that she has a white father.
Yeah.
And they have
Dear White People.
What is it? Dear
White People.
Dear
Yeah.
White People.
Yeah. Okay, so I am going to end it here. I could ask many more questions, but I think we've had a robust conversation to whet some appetites. I hope that you all will certainly read the novel, Larsen. I see a couple of people posted that they haven't read it yet, so please do read Larsen's Passing, as well as Quicksand. I would also suggest reading Thaddeus Davis's biography so that you can get some more of the nuances of Nella Larsen's life. Read the works of the folks who are here. Dr. Holloway, you have another novel coming out. Am I correct? The title?
Actually, it's Gone Missing. Oh, here, happen to have it here.
Okay.
Gone Missing in Harlem. What happens when a Black baby goes missing at the same time as the Lindbergh baby? Who do they go looking for? So I'm on this kick of in Harlem novels, but I had no idea when I wrote this book, my debut novel at 70, that A Death in Harlem that takes up at the moment of is she dead, when she comes down the stairs and finds her, that would be a film in 2 years. So it's stunning. I love this conversation. Thank you so much for having me in it.
I'm happy to hear this, Dr. Holloway, because as you can see behind my background, I am from Harlem. Any Harlem really make me happy.
I hope you enjoy it.
Yes.
Okay, great. So everyone have a great night and thank you all so much for your participation.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.